They say the early bird catches the worm, and this is absolutely true for ancient Egypt. For when Egypt spread its wings, it soared far and wide into the future, and its people would have never dreamed of seeing the world be a clone of Egypt. But was Egypt the early bird? Was it the first civilization of its type? Or was there another? For this, we would have to look at some quotes from ancient times. The Egyptians themselves regarded themselves as an offshoot of Nubians and other Africans further south. They did not believe that they had created their own civilization, but believed that there was another previous to them, obviously not as sophisticated as what the Egyptians became, but with the real impact. Gods that would be founded in Nubia even after the Egyptian civilization had carried on would be found again inside of Egypt. But there is a question that one needs to ask himself. Almost at all times in history, Nubia is added as a real civilization inside of Egypt. Egypt, in fact, considers itself incomplete without Nubians' territory. Why? Why would they believe that the Nubians are one with the Egyptians? Well, a quote from a later European scholar or historian can clear this up for us, but many other books also do this as well. This man, of course, lived in the early times of European civilization. I'm not talking about someone in the modern world. I'm talking about Diodorus Now, before we get to this quote, I think it's important to understand the stance of Diodorus Siculus. Diodorus Siculus made it quite obvious that, in his opinion, the ancient Egyptians predate the Greeks in everything, especially in the realm of civilization or things to do with human advancements. These include religion, these include poetry, art, and all kinds of things, including inventions as well. If we read this quote by him, he says this: the account of the Egyptians agrees also with the traditions which has been handed down among the Greeks since very early times, to the effect that Hercules cleared the earth of the wild beasts, a story which is in no way suitable for a man who lived in approximately the period of the Trojan War, when most parts of the inhabited world had already been reclaimed from their wild state by agriculture and cities, and the multitude of men settled everywhere. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek man who had seen his religion and compared it to the ancient Egyptians, saw that some kind of fusion had to be made because, of course, the religion of the ancient Egyptians is so ancient that if it does not match with that of the Greeks, then you cannot respect that religion. And so, in some cases, he edits the meanings and realities of the Greek religion based on the ancient Egyptian texts. Lacking bias in his work, he obviously gives credit to where it's due, and obviously it's with the Egyptians. This is surprising considering the fact that many of the historians or people in the past would love to give credit to their own civilization or other civilizations that are at least similar to their own. In Greek architecture, we see these columns that are fluted. These fluted columns seem to be unnecessary and serve no purpose at all. And even when it's added with floral patterns at the top, it doesn't seem to serve any purpose because the flowers would not have these type of grooves anyway. These vertical grooves serve no purpose but are aesthetically pleasing. But where did they get this idea? Well, they liked the idea that they got from the ancient Egyptians. You see, sometimes artists get carried away and they start speaking about symmetry and shadows and grooves and aesthetically pleasing and harmonically in alignment, when in real life, the real reason why the Greeks have this as part of their architecture is because it's stolen from the ancient Egyptians. And they do not know why the ancient Egyptians had this, even though the ancient Egyptians give us several identifications for where it came from. See, the civilization that ancient Egyptians were mimicking were other civilizations further south in Africa, and their own, which utilized their own type of civilization. They utilized these same instruments. As you can see, these ones are much more bulkier, although if you go to Egypt, you'll find the ones that are just as slim as the ones in Greece, which I will talk about next. But you notice here that these are huge. What do these represent? Well, firstly, if you look at the top, what you can see there is that there is a difference between the ones at the top and the ones at the bottom. And if you look at the ones at the top and bottom, you'll see that they're tied together with that middle piece. What's happening? Well, we're seeing firsthand with our own eyes the thinking process. See, when the Egyptians started to use stone, we see them struggle with it, and we see them starting to put their own brain inside of this and think, okay, so how do I match this with my actual history? This is how we know that they don't come from Sumeria or somewhere else, because they are struggling with the technology from a previous civilization, which they were. Just like how they will with the Tumalus, we see them baby steps go from little stone coverings and in circles to more rectangular to pyramids. In this case, we see them go from these pillars to slimmer pillars to eventually these beautiful things that people say are aesthetically pleasing for some natural reason, which is all made up. But one does not need to go far to find out exactly where the influence of this came from. If you look at Africa, luckily we still have some of these people doing this. And everybody knows that it's papyrus reeds that they utilized. So you can see there that what that represents is a bundle of reeds standing together. Remember in Ethiopia, when I showed you, there were those pillars that you see even in rock cutouts. Now, this has nothing to do with Egypt. I'm just using it as a comparison to show that you can see the logic behind something when it's original. So, for example, if you look at the building on this side, so the one that's brick face, you can see that it's got pillars coming out of it. It's got these little things coming out of it. But if you look at the other one that's a complete stone, so it's not a building, it's really a carving. If you look at it, it's also got it by the doors. It's got these pillars coming out, but those pillars are useless because they don't hold anything up. But because the people who created it had a culture and a knowledge of the previous architecture, it tells us that they were influenced by it and thought that it did something, so they just keep it. Now, of course, old habits die hard. And in this case, you can see, if you look at reeds, that the reason why these reeds are grooved in is because the ancient Egyptians who invented this type of pillar for themselves, there were other pillars in other parts of the world, but this type of pillar where you can see that it's looks like it's being wrapped around. If you look at it, you can see it. This comes purely from the fact that these reeds were wrapped around. And why would they do this? Well, of course, it strengthens the reed. So if you take one reed and you put it up, which a pillar, a solid pillar, without any intervention, looks like a single piece of reed. Remember, they're making this up. So things that seem obvious to us today, or even hilarious, were not to them. And of course, once it had been done, it becomes tradition and it becomes accepted. And so, for no reason whatsoever, they create these reeds, which are if you look at it, it's pretty obvious that's what they were trying to create, and they actually did it beautifully. So, in your head, if you want to picture exactly how the ancient Egyptians used to build buildings, well, used to build their first type of abodes, the way you have to think about it is you have to look at African reed houses. That's what they were mimicking in the beginning. Now, of course, the ancient Egyptians are not one to leave something to speculation. And as you can see here in one of Hatshepsut's temples, you can see that right next to the reeds, they put these pillars almost to give us the obviousness. So you can see how it's influenced directly by these things. And of course, you can see that one of the push outs or one of these things that make a triangular effect at the top is the actual plant itself before it's chipped away. But why would they continue to use this? Well, the real reason they would is because if you know anything about African religions, the symbol, like I said, is in the identity of the structure itself. So, in other words, that stone reed is a reed. It's not a different type of thing. It's not a stone. It's a reed. And this is true if you notice in Igbo, for example, they have dried reeds which they can use to ward off evil spirits, not as a symbol, but they believe that the dried reed itself does that. If you go to Africa, South Africa, the reeds is where the original man came from, or the original deity came from, depending on which version you're reading. And of course, if we go back to Egypt, we have the Sea of Reeds or the Field of Reeds. The Field of Reeds is where many gods dwell. Reeds are very popular in African mythology, and for this, we can see that it has a place. So, if you ask the question, if Africans continued to develop to a certain level, where would they go? Well, firstly, we do have it in West Africa, Swahili Coast, all of these who developed without changing religion, but we would have to look at them in their own particular context. And then we see it in Egypt that the symbols become, and the religion and the culture become the true drivers of this type of thing, coming from nowhere else but inside of their religion, really. The thing that really, really, really makes the culture of Egypt unique is their religious interpretation of the world. Everything is religion. And so pyramids are religious based, houses are religious based, how they spaced there is religious based. The workforces are religious based. These pillars are religious based. And so, what is the quote that we got from that ancient Greek man? Now, keep in mind, every single thing that I've said about this Greek writer is true. He had a very extensive knowledge of both the religion and he wanted to fuse it with his own. But not only did he do this, but he found out that other people inside of Egypt also believed that there was a fusion between their religion and the religions of the Egyptians. And not only that, their histories. So this is the quote. They say also that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians. That's the first quote. So what he's saying here is that the Egyptians, because it's a story about Cambyses and Amma and the other deities, and he says that based on the history of the Ethiopians, they are just an offshoot of the Ethiopians. And he clarifies this, even though it's mixed with mythology. Osiris having been the leader of the colony, for speaking generally, what is now Egypt, they maintain, was not land, but sea, when in the beginning the universe was being formed afterwards, however, as the Nile, during the times of its inundation, carried down the mud from Ethiopia. Land was gradually built up from the deposit. Also, the statements that all the land of the Egyptians is alluvial silt deposited by the river receives the clearest proof. Pause. Now, there's a reason why he says that. Because in this myth, which you can see it's mixed with reality, that the Nile comes from Ethiopia, the region of Ethiopia, and ends up in Egypt. And he says we can see this evidently. So for them, for him, this is proof that the story is based off of some type of reality. And then he continues to say, in their opinion, from what takes place at the outlets of the Nile, for as each year new mud is continually gathered together at the months of the river, the sea is observed being thrust back by the deposit silt, and the land receiving the increase and larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are they hold Ethiopian. I'll say that again. That last part is very important. And the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are they hold Ethiopian. So the customs, the history, the culture, basically what they are saying, and he is saying, is that at the time it was thought by both the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, and the Greeks that the culture of the Egyptians came from the Ethiopians and that they are just an offshoot. Their history, their culture, their reality, their growth comes from there. This is very, very important in observing. Think about it. These people lived a long time ago and they're saying this now. Now, this reality, of course, is not only held in the words of the Greeks, as the ancient Egyptians themselves said in some of the texts that I've read before, that their ancestors came from as far south as actual Ethiopia, today's Ethiopia. Remember when I showed you those texts by those pharaohs who went to the land of Punt, and they say that some of their ancestors came from that direction. And not only that, but we find Ethiopian languages, Cushite languages, all across the Nile, all the way to Egypt. And we find the same customs. So remember those people who would bury their people in a circle and then bury their cattle there, Nubian culture that was in that region. They call it Nubian, but it's Egyptian culture that has a obvious, let's say, not so evolved to become like the Egyptians. So they still maintain their heritage inside of that specific region during ancient Egypt. They maintained it perfectly. And so people just go, okay, they're Nubian. Anybody in Egypt who maintains the old customs, in other words, they are not fully embracing the new customs of Egypt, they instantly get put in the Nubian category. And you will notice this if you watch my Nubian files. No matter where they are, they can be at the tippity top of Egypt. Doesn't matter where they are. If they still have old customs, they're Nubian. In one section, Diodorus Siculus talks about medicine. And of course, medicine is tied with religion yet again. And he talks about how a lot of the medicines of the Egyptians were proven to work over those of the Greeks, and that Isis was responsible for these type of medicines being introduced into Egypt, at least the working ones. But as we know, and I will never stop mentioning this topic, the medicines of Africa, the rest of Africa, mimic those of Egypt by a million. like the architecture of Egypt, which has its roots in nature, and you can see its actual weaving. So you can see it like built up, like, okay, this is how it's built, this is how it works. Medicine is the same. We see the logic going from one place to another. Like, why would they scar themselves? Why would they throw up in order to get rid of certain things? Why would they believe in enemies? Why are they doing all of these things that seem to be old school to us today? And it's because they worked to some degree. And then because they worked, they're now just in the medicine. Remember, the ancient Egyptians were way above any other people in the world in terms of technology and everything else, but they still had this ancient practice. As Diodorus Siculus says, as for Isis, the Egyptians say that she was the discoverer of many health-giving drugs and was greatly versed in the science of healing. Consequently, now that she has attained immortality, she finds her greatest delight in the healing of mankind and gives aid in their sleep to those who call upon her, plainly manifesting both her very presence and her beneficence towards men who ask for help. In proof of this, as they say, they advance not legends as the Greeks do, but manifest facts. For practicality, the entire inhabited world is their witness in that it eagerly contributes to the honors of Isis, because she manifests herself in healings. For standing above the sick in their sleep, she gives them aid for their disease and works remarkable cures upon such as submit themselves to her, and many who have been despaired of by their physicians because of their difficult nature of their malady are restored to health by her. Now, the deep influence of this religious practice and also medical practice is also in a religious point of view. So, first, Isis, in this religious point of view, is seen in this triad. So, this triad is Horus, Osiris, and Isis. Isis being the healer, the female. Based on descriptions like that, and of course that triad, a lot of people have compared the Isis character to Jesus Christ of Nazareth, in that she manifests both body. So this was in the beginning you read, remember, she used to heal, and then she became immortal, and then she healed people from above. Remember that. So she used to heal in person. As we read here, she's to heal in person. As for Isis, the Egyptians say that she was the one discovered of the many health-giving drugs and was greatly versed in the science of healing. Consequently, now that she has attained immortality, she finds her greatest delight in the healing of mankind and gives aid in their sleep to those who call upon her, plainly manifesting both her very presence and her beneficence towards men who ask her for help. Think about that sentence and try to attach it religiously. So the claim being made here is that she does not just arrive in body, but she's there in spirit and she's there from above, depending on how you call upon her. And this is the religion of the ancient Egyptians. Remember, one of the things that I hate is how the religion of Egypt is usually put through narrative form, and they don't speak about how exactly they would call upon these gods. Like today, obviously, you get on your knees and put your hands together and pray. But what about back in the day? You can see here that the true manifestation of these gods is in these ways. And this is why they believed in it. It was so tied to their reality. So after this, we see in the Ebis Papyrus, right, in ancient Egypt, and I could look for it, but we don't have time anymore. But in ancient Egypt, bloodletting was a way of getting rid of your blood so that you can be pure again if you had too much blood. And this custom was known to the ancient Egyptians and was passed on to the Greeks, Indians, Arabians, all kinds of people accepted this type of medicine, which this is where the secret lies. It doesn't work. That's where the secret lies. That's therefore it's an invention that happened and has no reason for continuing. Remember the architecture I'm talking about. There's no reason for it to continue. You can tie it to art, you can tie it to philosophy, but in real life it doesn't work. But we find it in Africa, the continent over, meaning it came from somewhere in Africa and then it just grew. Let's pick a certain civilization in Africa which did not have access to both Egypt or any other civilization until very late. When Europeans first got to the Kingdom of Congo, they found a civilization that was almost completely isolated from the rest of the world, neither Muslim nor Christian, being complete animists, but speaking no other African language but their own, meaning that they were also disconnected from other African countries, only having some very little trade similarities. And so, taking this in mind, we should read the next part about medicine in the Kingdom of Congo, written by the earliest arrivers. This is from the book A Report from the Kingdom of Congo that was written in the 1500s. So, up to this date, remember, there is no real connection between Egypt or any other place in this specific region, like Angola or any of those, to Egypt. And this is what surprised the person. First, he mentions something else, which I will show right after this. And he says, for head maladies, head diseases, they apply certain small horns to the temple, first piercing the skin a little, and then sucking the blood into the horn still till it is full, using the same means for drawing blood from any other part of the body. When in pain, as a cure, this manner of bloodletting was practiced also in Egypt. Now, of course, you might be thinking, okay, so how does it work, this bloodletting? Well, you'll notice there it says when in pain. You see, what it does, it comes from the theory that if you draw from other parts of the body will target that part of the body and leave the other part of the body that is sick. This is something that you cannot make up if you do not understand its logic. You just built upon something that is already foundationally broken, but you don't know that it's foundationally broken because you don't know anything about its real history. But think about it, even in the 1500s, this person sits there and says, bloodletting was practiced also in Egypt. In his head, he already makes the connection. He mentions Egypt no other time, by the way, in this book. He only mentions it once. So before I close off, I just want to mention this last part because, of course, it was also in the section of medicine. And one of the things that help in medicine in Africa is music. And here's the interesting part again. He only mentions Moors once. And flutes are also played with great skill at the king's court, whilst the people dance somewhat in a Moorish fashion, with gravity and dignity. The common people use little rattles and pipes and familiar instruments, which are harsher and ruder in sound than those used by the nobles. So this is a mention where he's like, wait a minute, this is similar to the Moors. And only a couple paragraphs down, he says, wait a minute, this is similar to the Egyptians. And remember, the Moors and the Egyptians are the people that a lot of people today claim are highly tied to the rest of Africa. Is this just a coincidence? Or is it many layers from different times coming together to paint a perfect story? Anyway, like, share, subscribe. I will also want to paint pictures about how the gods were truly manifest in real life.